Captain Jake, Mad Dog McAllister, kicked open the doors to the Galactic Senate chamber like a man who hadn't been told no in a long time, or at least a man who had stopped caring when he did. The Senate, a sprawling, circular amphitheater, packed with representatives from 746 alien species, had been in the middle of a heated debate over space parking violations. A gelatinous ambassador from the Andromedan swarm had been passionately arguing that hyperlane tolls were an act of piracy when the doors exploded inward. McAllister marched in, his battered combat boots echoing through the chamber, carrying a large, slimy, and very much decapitated tentacled head. He strode to the center, casually flipped the head onto the gleaming Senate floor like it was a bowling ball, and cracked his knuckles. The entire chamber went silent. A few diplomats made horrified, gurgling noises. A fish-looking delegate turned an alarming shade of pale blue and began sobbing into his own tentacles. Several aliens fainted on the spot, their security details scrambling to catch them before they hit the ground. McAllister exhaled. "All right, nerds. Who wants to talk peace?" Premier Blarg, the 12-foot-tall, mucus-slicked overlord of the Glorflax Empire, slowly rose from his elevated throne at the head of the chamber. His enormous amphibious frame trembled with barely contained rage. His bulbous eyes bulged, his long, spindly fingers gripping the armrests of his ornate, gold-encrusted chair. You can't be here," Blarg sputtered, his voice a wet gurgle of disbelief. "Pretty sure I am," McAllister said, glancing down at his own boots. "Yup, definitely here." Blarg's entire face twitched. How did you get past security?" McAllister shrugged. "Oh, those guys. Yeah, they're taking a nap. Should wake up in a few hours. If they don't, well, that's a problem for future you." Another alien senator, a spindly, bird-like creature with shimmering green feathers, finally found their voice. That is the severed head of Emperor Blorkslax." McAllister gave an exaggerated thumbs up. "Ding ding! Give the bird a prize!" Blarg's gelatinous skin turned a deep, furious shade of purple. You slaughtered our emperor?" "Oh, come on, don't be dramatic," McAllister said, shaking his head. "I didn't slaughter him. That implies it was messy and unplanned. This was surgical. And to be fair, the guy had it coming. You lot tried to wipe us out 5 years ago, remember?" Blarg's mouth opened and closed several times, his tendrils twitching violently. "You were deemed a rising threat. The Galactic Senate voted to contain you." McAllister scoffed. "Yeah, well, you guys sucked at that. Turns out, when you try to exterminate an entire species, they tend to get a little cranky. So here we are." A small, furry alien senator with wide, rodent-like eyes raised a trembling paw. And what exactly do you want?" McAllister grinned. It was not a comforting grin. "Oh, I'm glad you asked," he said, stretching his arms. "See, after y'all tried to wipe us off the face of the universe, we could have just died quietly. Instead, we did what humans do best, got petty as hell. First, we took out half the Glorflax homeworld. Then, we stole all their precious hyperspace. Fuel. Shout out to Unobtainium 126. Really good stuff. Oh, and then we started using your trade routes to build our own fleet. A better fleet. Just for funsies." The chamber collectively gasped. Blarg took a staggering step forward. That's impossible. The intelligence report said you still relied on primitive laser cannons." McAllister clicked his tongue. "Yeah, about that. Turns out your spies kinda suck. Our guys were building railguns before your analysts finished filling out their TPS reports." A rotund, slug-like diplomat gurgled in distress. The Glorflax Empire had an entire fleet protecting their borders." McAllister scratched his chin. "Had is the operative word there." There was a long, stunned silence. Then, an octopus-like delegate with shimmering bioluminescent spots managed to choke out, "So, why are you here?" McAllister took a deep breath, theatrically dusted off his jacket, and leaned in. "I'm here," he said, "because I figured we should talk before I start pressing buttons." On cue, every screen in the chamber flickered on, displaying live feeds of McAllister's backup. 15 cloaked warships hovering in a loose formation. Around the Senate station, their weapons very much online and very much aimed at important things. The senators collectively lost their minds. Blarg's mouth opened and closed several times, his tendrils twitching violently. You were deemed a rising threat. The Galactic Senate voted to contain you. McAllister scoffed. Yeah, well, you guys sucked at that. Turns out, when you try to exterminate an entire species, they tend to get a little cranky. So here we are. A small, furry alien senator with wide, rodent-like eyes raised a trembling paw. And what exactly do you want? McAllister grinned. It was not a comforting grin. Oh, I'm glad you asked, he said, stretching his arms. See, after y'all tried to wipe us off the face of the universe, we could have just died quietly. Instead, we did what humans do best, got petty as hell. First, we took out half the Glorflax homeworld. Then, we stole all their precious hyperspace. Fuel. Shout out to Unobtainium 126. Really good stuff. Oh, and then we started using your trade routes to build our own fleet. A better fleet. You know, just for funsies. The chamber collectively gasped. Blarg took a staggering step forward. That's impossible. The intelligence report said you still relied on primitive laser cannons. McAllister clicked his tongue. Yeah, about that. Turns out your spies kinda suck. Our guys were building railguns before your analysts finished filling out their TPS reports. A rotund, slug-like diplomat gurgled in distress. The Glorflax Empire had an entire fleet protecting their borders. McAllister scratched his chin. Had is the operative word there. There was a long, stunned silence. Then, an octopus-like delegate with shimmering bioluminescent spots managed to choke out, So, why are you here? McAllister took a deep breath, theatrically dusted off his jacket, and leaned in. I'm here, he said, because I figured we should talk before I start pressing buttons. On cue, every screen in the chamber flickered on, displaying live feeds of McAllister's backup. 15 cloaked warships hovering in a loose formation. Around the Senate station, their weapons very much online and very much aimed at important things. The senators collectively lost their minds. The Galactic Senate chamber had never been so quiet. A vote had been called, a vote that no one had expected to ever take place, least of all under duress, while a sleep-deprived human with a penchant for violence stood in the center of the chamber, arms crossed, smiling like a wolf in a room full of nervous sheep. A dozen translators across the chamber sputtered as they tried to process the words, their circuits likely overheating from the sheer absurdity of the situation. The assembled alien dignitaries shifted uneasily in their seats, some whispering urgently into communication devices, others looking around as if they were waiting for some higher power to intervene. No such intervention came. All right, let's speed this up, McAllister said, clapping his hands together. I got places to be, war crimes to commit, a celebratory drink to chug. Let's get those votes in before I start getting bored. A ripple of alarm passed through the chamber. No one wanted to see what a bored human, especially this human, was capable of. Premier Blarg, who had spent years underestimating the species now standing before him, attempted to regain control of the situation. He straightened his gelatinous, amphibian-like frame and slammed a webbed hand onto the console in front of him. The impact was less impressive than he had hoped, mostly producing a wet splap sound, but the effect was enough to draw attention. This is an outrage. A human cannot simply demand a vote, he bellowed. This is the highest governing body in the galaxy, not some backwater planetary council. We do not negotiate with terrorists. McAllister raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? Then why do you all look like you're about to soil your expensive space robes? A few representatives instinctively adjusted their ceremonial attire, clearly offended at the very suggestion. Blarg, however, was not amused. The Galactic Senate is not some mere collection of cowards, the Premier insisted. We have faced countless threats throughout history, hostile species, warlike civilizations, existential catastrophes. We have overcome them all. We will not bow to a barbarian with an oversized handgun. McAllister smirked and casually tapped the holster at his side. Oversized. Buddy, this is just my sidearm. The big guns are outside, surrounding this station. You want to keep pretending you're in control, or do you want to vote before I start running out of patience? He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping to a more menacing tone. Because the last thing you want is for me to start improvising. Blarg's mouth twitched. He was rapidly realizing that he had no leverage here. He turned his gaze toward the other. Senators, seeking allies in the room, but the sheer terror in their eyes made it clear no one wanted to push McAllister any further. Fine, Blarg snarled. We vote. A collective exhale rippled through the chamber. This was, of course, a formality, an attempt to maintain some illusion of dignity in a situation where they had already lost. The decision had been made the moment McAllister had walked in with a severed head and a casual attitude. A large holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber, illuminating the entire room with its cold blue glow. The words, "Proposal, Temporary Human Membership in the Galactic Senate," scrolled across the screen, along with a simple set of choices. Yes, Quan, no, abstain. The senators hesitated. McAllister sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, let me make this really easy for you. Anyone who votes no is personally invited to test out the explosive yield of our newest missile prototypes. Any abstentions? You're getting wedgied by my Marines in front of your entire species. A murmur of distress spread through the chamber. An elderly, tree-like representative from the Runglar Consortium weakly raised a branch. Excuse me, Captain, what is a wedgie? McAllister grinned. You don't want to find out. That was all it took. The voting began. One by one, senators pressed their respective choices, their holographic interfaces lighting up in confirmation. The results displayed in real time, and as McAllister watched the numbers climb, he couldn't help but appreciate the sheer, beautiful absurdity of the situation, and in favor. 274 against. 94 abstentions. The chamber went deathly silent. The voting tally pulsed on the holographic display, marking the decision as official. The Senate had just, against all logic and reason, voted to accept humanity into its ranks. McAllister let out a low whistle. Huh, would you look at that? He turned to Blarg, whose gelatinous skin had turned an unsettling shade of gray. Looks like democracy works after all. Blarg trembled, gripping his armrests with enough force that the soft, rubbery material deformed under his grasp. You rigged this process. You intimidated the Senate into compliance, McAllister blinked. And? The room fell into another stunned silence. McAllister let out a hearty laugh, throwing an arm around the nearest senator, a small, anxious, bat-like creature who looked ready to pass out. Look, the way I see it, we just did what y'all thought. You did 5 years ago. Only difference? We're actually better at it. He gestured toward the severed head still resting on the floor. Now, if we're done crying over spilled tentacles, let's talk terms. Blarg slammed a fist against his console again. This is an insult to the integrity of the Senate. McAllister rolled his eyes. Blarg, buddy, I walked in here with a severed head and a threat, and y'all still managed to put it to a vote. That means you guys did this to yourselves. Don't get mad at me because democracy decided to speedrun itself. Blarg seethed, his entire body quivering with barely restrained rage, but he knew they had lost. The Senate had spoken. Humanity was now a recognized entity in galactic politics. McAllister straightened, clasping his hands together. Now then, since we're official members, I assume there's some kind of welcome package, maybe a gift basket, a commemorative plaque? Hell, I'll even take a discount on interstellar parking fees. A bespectacled, bureaucratic-looking alien hesitantly stepped forward. Well, there is a formal induction ceremony, but it typically takes months of preparation and McAllister held up a hand. Nope, fast-track it. Make it happen within the hour. The bureaucrat blanched. That's highly within the hour. McAllister repeated, his grin widening in a way that suggested There would be consequences for any further objections. The bureaucrat nodded furiously and scurried away. McAllister turned back to the Senate. Well, folks, it's been a pleasure. Looking forward to being the absolute worst decision you've ever made. With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the exit, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The Senate chamber was left in stunned silence as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Humanity had just bulldozed its way into galactic politics, and now the real chaos would begin. The official induction ceremony for humanity's entrance into the Galactic Senate was scheduled to take place in the Grand Hall of Celestial Concordance, a name that suggested dignity, grace, and high diplomatic decorum. McAllister was about to ruin all of that. He walked into the hall, flanked by his team, hardened human soldiers wearing slightly cleaned-up versions of their combat gear, which was the closest thing they had to a formal military uniform. Instead of the polished robes and ornate regalia favored by most species in the Senate, McAllister had slapped a shiny diplomat badge on his tactical vest, just to make sure nobody got confused about his new title. The Grand Hall was a sprawling chamber of towering crystalline pillars and floating holographic banners, displaying the sigils of all Senate species. It had hosted centuries of historic treaties, diplomatic accords, and legendary speeches. Now it was hosting McAllister, who was currently nudging his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez, and whispering, "So when do we get free snacks?" Ramirez, a battle-hardened Marine who had personally led boarding operations against some of the deadliest alien warships in the galaxy, gave him an exasperated look. "Sir, can we please try not to start a war during the ceremony?" "McAllister?" scoffed. "You're acting like it'd be the first time." At the front of the chamber, Premier Blarg stood, still seething from the Senate vote. He was clearly attempting to maintain some semblance of composure, but his bulbous eyes twitched violently every time he looked in McAllister's direction. Next to him, a long-winded bureaucrat was already halfway through reading an ancient induction oath in 12 different languages, only 5 of which had vowels. McAllister, already bored, leaned toward a nearby senator, an insectoid creature with 6 glistening compound eyes. "Hey, quick question. How long is this speech?" The senator, startled, clicked its mandibles nervously. The traditional induction vow spans 172 standard minutes. Keep covering the foundational." McAllister groaned loudly, cutting him off. "Yeah, nope. Speed this up." The bureaucrat, horrified at the interruption, nearly choked on his own words. But the sacred tradition, yeah, sacred traditions and all that." McAllister waved a hand dismissively. "Here, I got one for you. I solemnly swear to be a pain in the ass to every corrupt galactic politician I meet." "There, done. Somebody hand me the official membership thingy." The assembled dignitaries gasped. Blarg audibly choked. The bureaucrat, now visibly shaking, looked to the Premier for guidance. Blarg, who had already lost control of this disaster hours ago, could only wave a resigned hand. McAllister grinned as an assistant scuttled forward and hesitantly handed him the official Galactic Membership Data Crystal TM, a small, glowing object, embedded with the formal recognition codes for humanity's Senate status. McAllister pocketed it like it was a spare USB drive. "Cool. So when do we get voting rights? Do we get an office, a parking spot, a secret handshake?" The bureaucrat fumbled with his notes. The process of integrating a new species into the Senate is typically a multi-year endeavor." McAllister clapped his hands. "Not anymore. We're fast-tracking everything. Starting now, we're in. We get a vote. We get a say in galactic matters. And most importantly," he pointed directly at Blarg, "we get access to the unobtainium 126 reserves." Blarg's entire body spasmed with fury. "Absolutely not!" McAllister tilted his head. Funny, because it kind of sounded like a yes to me. "You cannot be serious," Blarg bellowed. "Humanity is a reckless, war-hungry species that has already caused immense destruction. You cannot be trusted with any access to hyperspace fuel reserves? McAllister smirked. And yet, here we are. He crossed his arms. You tried to wipe us out, remember? And now, we're sitting at the big kids' table. You do realize what that means, right? Blarg bared his sharp, needle-like teeth. That you are a disease upon civilized space. McAllister nodded. Yeah, see? That's your perspective. My perspective? We're just really good at surviving and taking what we need. He spread his arms dramatically. Listen, pal, I get it. You don't, like us. You'd rather see us dead, but guess what? We're not dead. And now, we're part of the system you built, which means you either work with us, or we work around you. Blarg's hands twitched. If you dare attempt to steal from the Senate's reserves, steal is such an ugly word, McAllister said, shaking his head. I prefer redistribute. Blarg's tendrils quivered in unfiltered rage. You are an absolute menace. Appreciate that, McAllister replied. Now, let's get to the next item on the agenda. Galactic reparations for attempted. Human genocide. The chamber exploded into chaos. Dozens of senators erupted in horrified gasps, frantic whispering, and panicked gesturing. Some were already consulting legal advisors via holographic interfaces. Others were looking around, hoping someone else would step in and say something rational. No such luck. Blarg slammed a webbed hand onto the podium. This is outrageous. Humanity was declared a rising threat. The containment effort was a war crime, McAllister finished for him. Yeah, that's how we saw it. You cannot demand reparations for a justified security measure. McAllister shrugged. That's funny, because we just did. Blarg's eyes twitched violently. You will never get the Senate to agree to such a demand. McAllister smiled. Don't have to? He casually tapped his wrist communicator. Yo, Commander Briggs, you copy? A voice crackled to life over the comms. Loud and clear, boss. Go ahead and light up the display. High above the Senate chamber, the massive panoramic screens that typically displayed Senate proceedings suddenly switched feeds. Instead of dull, parliamentary records, a live transmission from orbit took over. A fleet of human warships, heavily armed, floating just outside the Senate station. The chamber fell into terrified silence. McAllister whistled. Would you look at that? More human ships than y'all thought we had. Funny how bad your intelligence reports are, huh? Blarg's throat made a strangled, gurgling noise. You wouldn't dare. McAllister held up a small, unassuming device with a bright red button. You know, I was just telling my guys how I didn't want to start a war today, but if y'all insist on making things difficult, I can absolutely adjust my schedule. Blarg clutched the edge of his podium, shaking with barely contained fury. He knew what this was. It wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't even a negotiation. It was a shakedown. McAllister leaned in, voice lowering to a near whisper. Give us the fuel. Give us reparations. Or we start pressing buttons. You really want to see what happens when humans stop playing nice. The chamber held its collective breath. For a long, excruciating moment, Blarg stared at McAllister, his face contorting in rage and defeat. Then, slowly, he exhaled. What are your terms? He hissed. McAllister grinned. That's more like it. And just like that, the first official act of humanity in the Galactic Senate was organized extortion. McAllister loved politics. The silence in the Galactic Senate chamber was so thick it could have suffocated a vacuum-breathing species. Every representative, from the fur-covered Yavari to the floating gas cloud delegates of the Gigswife, watched in abject horror as Captain Jake Mad Dog McAllister, newly inducted human senator and self-proclaimed ambassador of tactical flexibility, leaned forward with the casual menace of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Premier Blarg looked like he had aged a decade in the last 5 minutes. His usually slick, gelatinous skin had dried and cracked under the stress of the situation. His tendrils twitched violently, as he processed the reality of what had just happened. Humanity, the species that the Senate had voted to exterminate, was now a recognized political entity. And their first order of business was not humble gratitude, nor diplomatic reconciliation. No, their first act was demanding war reparations under threat of orbital bombardment. Blarg's voice was a hoarse, trembling whisper. "You are asking for something that has never been granted in the history of this body." McAllister grinned. "Well, first time for everything." A frazzled-looking senator from the Andromedan swarm, a species that resembled sentient coral, clattered its chitinous appendages against its podium. "This is extortion! The Senate cannot be bullied into compliance!" McAllister gestured to the still-active transmission screens, where the terrifying silhouette of humanity's newest warships loomed in orbit. "We're not bullying," he said. "We're negotiating with incentives." The room collectively tensed. Blarg turned his attention to the other delegates, desperation in his bulbous eyes. Surely you all see how preposterous this is. We cannot reward terrorism." A senator from the Runglar Consortium, a species resembling mobile, sentient trees, nervously raised a branch-like limb. "Well, to be fair, technically, it was we who attempted genocide first." Blarg nearly choked. "You cannot be serious." The Runglar senator clicked its mandibles together. "I mean, from an objective perspective, their retaliation was simply a logical escalation. We destroyed 27 of their colonies," Blarg shouted. McAllister nodded. "Right. And we took out half the Glorflax homeworld, and let's not forget, your entire fleet." He glanced at the tree alien. "By the way, I like this guy. See? This guy gets it." Blarg wheezed, barely holding himself. "Together. This is madness." McAllister tapped his fingers on the podium. "Nah, see, madness would be if we just started firing those orbital cannons right now." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial. "Oh, and you know what the funniest part of all this is, Blarg? You could have had peace. If you'd just let us be, we'd still be some backwater species fighting over rock samples on Mars. But no, you had to get paranoid. You had to preemptively strike, thinking you were stopping some grand threat before it happened. But guess what? You made us that threat?" Blarg didn't reply. He knew it was true. Every senator in the chamber knew it was true. McAllister turned to the assembly. "So here's the deal. We get a cut of your unobtainium 126 reserves. We get war reparations. Nothing. Crazy, just enough to rebuild the colonies you nuked. And in return, we don't press any of these lovely buttons we've installed on our warships." A tense silence stretched across the room. Then, ever so hesitantly, a single delegate, a frail, amphibious creature with large, watery eyes, raised a limb. "How much unobtainium 126 are we talking about?" McAllister beamed. "See, now we're talking business." Blarg slammed his fist against the podium. "You are rewarding them for warmongering." Another senator, a hulking, rock-skinned, being from the Vrakul Dominion, crossed their arms. "No offense, Premier, but they did just outmaneuver all of us." A murmur of reluctant agreement rippled through the chamber. McAllister clapped his hands together. "All right, let's make this simple. You lot are the math nerds, right? Go ahead and crunch some numbers. We'll wait." A team of bureaucrats scrambled to their data pads, hastily whispering and calculating damage assessments, energy reserve distributions, and economic impact projections. Meanwhile, McAllister turned to Ramirez and gestured vaguely at the room. "See? This is why I love negotiations. You just gotta find the right leverage." Ramirez gave him a flat look. "Sir, this is literally extortion with extra steps." McAllister shrugged. "Call it what you want. It works." After several agonizing minutes, the head bureaucrat, a shaking, jellyfish-like being, turned back to the Senate floor. We propose a 15% share of our unobtainium 126 reserves, distributed over the next decade." McAllister let out a low whistle. "That's a really cute offer." He tilted his head. Let me show you our counteroffer. He raised his wrist communicator. Briggs, give him a little fireworks show. Above the Senate station, a human warship disintegrated an uninhabited asteroid on the edge of the system. The explosion was visible even from the chamber's viewports. McAllister grinned as the room filled with horrified gasps. How about 50%? Blarg collapsed into his chair, looking like he was on the verge of an aneurysm. The head bureaucrat paled. That's impossible. That would cripple our energy infrastructure. McAllister leaned forward. So, how about we meet in the middle? 35%, Blarg wheezed. This is an affront to everything the Senate stands for. A large, beetle-like senator chittered. It's also a pretty good deal compared to orbital annihilation. The bureaucrat gulped. 35%? Phased out over 15 years? McAllister snapped his fingers. Now that's a number I like. He turned to the assembly. All in favor? A majority of trembling hands, tendrils, claws, and appendages slowly rose. Blarg gripped his podium, his entire body trembling with fury. I will never forget this, human, McAllister grinned. Aw, Blarg, you say that like we're not gonna be working together forever now. The final vote passed. It was official. Humanity had strong-armed its way into galactic politics. They had secured resources, reparations, and influence in ways no species had ever dared before. As McAllister turned to leave, Ramirez shook his head. Sir, you do realize they're never going to forgive us for this. McAllister clapped him on the back. That's the best part, Ramirez. The more they hate us, the more they'll fear us. And the more they fear us, the more we win. Ramirez sighed. You really enjoy this, don't you? McAllister laughed. Buddy, this is just the beginning. Now let's go find that bar. And with that, humanity's first official day. As a galactic power ended in the only way that made sense, with a really stiff drink